Okay, it's Professor Olivetti here. Today I want to talk about some very technical language that we use in theology and scripture studies. And that is the difference between the literal sense of scripture and a literalist interpretation of scripture, also known as a fundamentalist interpretation of scripture. Now, this first term, the literal sense of scripture, is written in green because it is what is endorsed and used by the Catholic Church. And a literal sense of scripture is what the authors intended their original audience to understand. So a contemporary example of this would be if I said that one of the players at the basketball game was on fire. I would mean that they were making a lot of buckets, right? It's a symbolic term. And notice that words that I use are symbols in that case. Now, a literalist interpretation of that same phrase would be if I said that so-and-so was on fire, that you would be upset because you would think that that their body had actually caught on fire at the game. And you would be worried about them being burned and maybe even dying or having some injury, right? That would be the literalist interpretation. Okay, what would be the mistake there is that you would just look at the words I said without understanding the meaning. And that's what the literalist or fundamentalist interpretation does, and that's why it is condemned by the Catholic Church. So if we look at a scriptural example, we can look at the 7 days of creation in Genesis 1, which is like Genesis 2 and 3, a symbolic account. Right? So in the first creation story, the one in Genesis 1, the universe is basically created in 7 days. Now, the literal sense of this is not that the universe was created in 7 24-hour days. That is not what the author intended their audience to understand. What the author was trying to get across to their audience, which you can see if you look at the context in which this story was written, was that they were trying to tell their audience that God created an orderly universe for humans to live in. A nice place, in other words. Now, literalist interpretation or fundamentalist interpretations of this text make the mistake that they don't understand the context of the authors. They don't understand what they meant. They simply look at the words and say, it says 7 days, so it means 7 days. So it's a mistaken interpretation, right? Why? Because they don't understand the context and the meaning of the words that the authors were using. Literal sense. This is good, right? This is what they meant. This is where we find the inspired revelation. Literalist sense, we have to be careful about this because it can lead us to miss the meaning, right? So that being said, I need you in your papers and in your tests and quizzes, whatever discussions, whatever we're doing, I need you to specifically express which one of these concepts you are writing about. So please use the term literal sense of scripture or literalist interpretation of scripture. Then I'll know whether you mean what the authors meant or if you're talking about a simple word-for-word interpretation. If you write something like, the literal meaning, I will feel like, what? I won't know what you mean. I won't know if you're talking about what the authors meant or If you're using literal more like the sense we use in everyday language today, in contemporary American English, where you're meaning exactly the words that I'm saying is exactly what I mean. I won't know if the basketball player is having a great game or if there's a tragedy that has broken out in the arena, right? I don't know what this means. Do you mean literal sense of scripture, what the authors meant, or do you mean a literalist interpretation? Please don't use this term. Use literal sense of scripture or literalist interpretation, or if you want to avoid the confusion, you could say fundamentalist interpretation. These meanings are the same. If you give me a term like literally, I will have the reaction of, say what? Again, when you're saying this, I don't know what you mean. I don't know if you mean literal sense of scripture, what the authors intended, or if you mean a literalist interpretation, a simple word for word reading of the text. If you say something like literal interpretation, again, I do not understand what that means. I can't tell if you are distinguishing the important difference between these two terms or not. So please use one of these terms, literal sense of scripture or literalist interpretation of scripture, also known as a fundamentalist interpretation of scripture. This is the one we endorse. This is the one we find the author's intention in, the inspired author's intention. All right? This is the one that can get us into all kinds of trouble. Now, one last word. The literal sense of scripture is not always symbolic. You know, when St. Paul says things like, I went to Corinth, St. Paul means that he actually went to Corinth. He's not talking about it in a symbolic way. So it doesn't make it literal sense of scripture. It's not depend on whether it's symbolic or if it is intended to be more directly word for word. This just means what the author intended. So if they meant you to take it as word for word fact, then the literal sense would be word for word fact. And there's lots of parts of scripture that are like that. But if they meant you to take it as symbolic, then the literal sense of scripture would be symbolic. And there's lots of parts of scripture that are like that too. So please let me know which one you mean by using one of these terms, literal sense of scripture or literalist interpretation, which is the same thing as a fundamentalist interpretation. Okay, thanks a lot. Enjoy the rest of the module. Please incorporate this lesson into your papers, tests, quizzes, and discussions.